Try to predict your next thought before it happens, right now. What will you think next? You can't. And that should bother you a lot more than it does. Thoughts don't feel generated. They feel received. They arrive already formed, already in words, already pointed in a direction. And you experience them as if you wrote them, but you didn't write them. You were just the first one to read them. The neuroscience here is uncomfortable, and most people never look at it directly because the alternative, that you are the author of your own mind, is so convincing, so total, so woven into every experience you've ever had, that questioning it feels absurd. But let's look at it anyway. In 1983, a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet ran an experiment that has never stopped being controversial. He hooked people up to EEG machines, measuring electrical activity in the brain, and asked them to make a simple voluntary movement, flex a wrist whenever they felt like it. No schedule, no prompt, pure, spontaneous choice. He also had them watch a fast-moving clock and note the exact position of the hand at the moment they first felt the urge to move, the moment they became aware of intending to move. What he found, brain activity associated with the upcoming movement, a signal called the readiness potential, began about 550 milliseconds before the movement. That's expected. Brains take time to prepare actions. What was not expected, conscious awareness of the intention to move, came about 350 to 400 milliseconds after the brain activity began. The neural decision, as a measurable physical event in the brain, preceded conscious awareness of deciding by more than a third of a second. The brain started preparing the action before the person knew they were going to act. This has been replicated, extended, made more precise with fMRI technology that can measure activity in specific brain regions. In some studies, researchers watching brain scans can predict which of two buttons a person will press up to 10 seconds before the person reports deciding. 10 seconds of neural buildup to what feels, from the inside, like a spontaneous choice made in the moment. The uncomfortable interpretation, not the only interpretation, but the one that keeps coming back, is that the conscious experience of deciding is the brain noticing a decision that was already made, not making it, noticing it. You're downstream of your own choices, and it gets deeper than that. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 95 and 99% of brain processing is unconscious, not repressed in the Freudian sense, just below the threshold of awareness. Language comprehension happens unconsciously. By the time you hear a sentence and understand it, the processing is done, and you only get the result. Object recognition is unconscious. You see a chair, not a collection of edges and surfaces that your visual cortex assembled. Emotional responses are unconscious. You feel something before you know why. Social judgments happen unconsciously. You form impressions of people in milliseconds, long before any deliberate evaluation. What reaches consciousness is not the processing, it's the output, a finished product delivered to you without any receipt showing how it was made. You experience the conclusion, not the argument that produced it. You experience the judgment, not the evidence that weighed it. And then, here's the part that should really land. You construct a story about how you reached that conclusion, and you experience that story as a memory of thinking. The sense that you consciously worked through something, that you thought it over carefully, that you arrived at a conclusion through deliberate reasoning. That feeling is frequently constructed after the fact, not always, but more often than feels comfortable. This isn't speculation. There's a specific experiment that makes it concrete. Patients who have had the corpus callosum, the thick bundle of fibers connecting the two brain hemispheres, severed for medical reasons, are called split brain patients. Their two hemispheres can't communicate. Researchers can exploit this by presenting information exclusively to one hemisphere, say flashing an image only in the left visual field, which goes to the right hemisphere, and then asking the patient to respond with the left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere. Here's the classic version. The right hemisphere sees the word walk, and the patient gets up and starts walking. The left hemisphere, the one that controls speech, didn't see the instruction. When researchers ask, "Why did you stand up?" the left hemisphere needs to answer. It didn't see any instruction. It has no idea why the body just stood up. It doesn't say, "I don't know." It never says that. It produces an answer immediately and confidently. "I wanted to stretch my legs. I felt like getting some water." Something plausible, something that fits, invented on the spot, experienced as memory. Neuroscientists Michael Gazzaniga and Joseph Ledoux called this the interpreter. a system in the left hemisphere that generates explanations for behavior and experience, regardless of whether it actually has access to the real cause. The interpreter doesn't wait for accurate information. It fills in the gap with whatever narrative fits, and that narrative feels like recollection. The split brain research reveals it cleanly because the two hemispheres are isolated. But the interpreter operates in all of us, all the time. We just can't isolate it from the outside. When you feel certain you know why you did something, there's a real possibility you're experiencing the interpreter's output, a plausible story constructed after the behavior, not a genuine memory of conscious motivation. Now the inputs. Because even setting aside whether thoughts are consciously generated, where does the raw material come from? Every thought you have is built from language, concepts, framings, metaphors, and categories that you didn't invent. You absorbed them from the culture you were born into, the family you grew up in, the language you learned to speak, the books you read, the conversations you had, the media you consumed, the words you think in. You didn't make those up. The categories you used to divide the world, you inherited them. The things you take as obvious, you were taught them so early and so consistently that they stopped feeling taught. The language you think in doesn't just transmit thought, it shapes what thoughts are possible. There's a concept in Japanese, amai, that describes a kind of comfortable presumed dependence on another person's benevolence. There's no precise English equivalent. English speakers can understand the concept when it's explained. But it doesn't arise naturally, spontaneously, as a thought, because there's no word waiting to trigger it. The concept exists in the space between words, and it's harder to think because of that. Benjamin Lee Horf's strong version of this, that language determines thought entirely, is probably too strong. But the weak version, that language shapes thought, makes some things easier to think and some things harder, has a lot going for it. And your emotional state right now is shaping which associations fire. The same question, asked when you're anxious versus when you're calm, produces different answers. Not because the facts changed, because which neural pathways activate depends on your current state. And different pathways lead to different associations, and different associations lead to different conclusions. You think you're evaluating the question. You're partly evaluating the question and partly revealing the current configuration of your nervous system. Then there's priming, which is where this gets really unsettling. Priming is when exposure to a word, image, or concept makes related concepts more accessible, without any awareness that this happened. The most famous example: researchers had participants unscramble sentences containing words related to elderly people, words like Florida, gray, wrinkle, bingo. After the task, they were let go. Researchers covertly timed how long it took them to walk to the elevator. They walked more slowly, measurably, significantly more slowly, without knowing they were doing it, without intending it, without any conscious awareness that the words had affected them at all. The thought, or in this case, the behavior, felt spontaneous. It was installed. Advertising operates entirely on this principle. You see a car ad with beautiful landscapes and freedom and adventure. You don't consciously think, I associate this car with freedom. But later, when you're considering cars, that association is more accessible. It fires more easily. It feels like your own intuition. Political framing operates this way. Whether an issue is described as illegal immigration or undocumented workers doesn't just describe the same thing differently. It primes different networks of associations before any evaluation begins. The thought that arrives after the framing feels like an independent judgment. It was partly shaped by the framing. Social media feeds are priming machines running continuously. What you're repeatedly exposed to becomes what's accessible. What's accessible shapes what arrives. The thought feels like yours because you don't remember what installed it, and the installation process was invisible. The voice in your head, the inner monologue that feels most intimately, undeniably you. That voice has a history that predates you. Lev Vygotsky, a Soviet psychologist who did most of his work in the 1920s and 30s, observed something important about how children develop thinking. Young children think out loud. They narrate what they're doing. They argue with themselves verbally. They talk through problems externally with other people before they can do it internally. His insight, inner speech, the internal monologue, develops as an internalization of external speech. Children begin by talking to others. They gradually bring that process inside. Thinking in language is, in its developmental origin, a social act that was moved indoors, which means the voice in your head has the cadence, vocabulary, judgment patterns, and emotional tone of specific people you encountered early in life: parents, teachers, older siblings, early caregivers. The way they talked to you became the way you talked to yourself. The criticisms they voiced became the criticisms you direct inward. The frameworks they used to make sense of the world became the frameworks you use. The most private thing about you, the internal voice that feels like the core of your consciousness, is built from other people, not metaphorically, developmentally, structurally. And the cultural layer goes even deeper than the personal one. What counts as obvious, what requires an explanation, what's not even considered a question, all of that varies enormously across cultures and historical periods. People in medieval Europe didn't think, "I have religious beliefs." They thought about reality. The framework was so total, it was invisible. We're inside frameworks right now that future people will see clearly, and we can't see it all. The thoughts that feel most obvious, the ones that barely feel like thoughts, the ones that are just the way things are, those are the most thoroughly installed. All of this leads to the free will question, and I want to be precise here, because it's easy to slide into a version of this that's more dramatic than what the evidence actually says. Every thought is caused by prior brain states. Those brain states were caused by prior experience, genetics, and environment. That chain of causation goes back before you were born. In that sense, in the mechanistic, physical sense, your thoughts are determined by things that were in place before you had any say. You feel like you're choosing. That feeling is real. It's a genuine experience, a genuine feature of what it's like to be you. But the experience isn't evidence for the mechanism. The experience of choosing is itself a product of the same brain that's producing everything else. A thermostat responds to temperature and changes state. It doesn't feel like it's choosing. You respond to inputs, sensory information, memory, emotional state, priming, language, and change state, and you feel like you're choosing. The difference might be the feeling of choice, not the presence of choice in any mechanistic sense. This is not nihilism. Knowing the mechanism doesn't change the experience. It doesn't make decisions irrelevant or choices meaningless. What you expose yourself to changes the inputs. What you practice changes the brain states. What you attend to changes what fires. Within the determined system, there's enormous variation in what gets determined, and that variation is what we ordinarily call agency. But it does mean that I thought of this myself as a much more complicated claim than it feels like. Feynman, and this is where the title comes from, had a specific obsession that I think is the most useful frame for all of this. He was constantly distinguishing between knowing the name of something and knowing something. He'd use the example of a bird. His father taught him that a certain bird was called a brown-throated thrush, and in other languages had other names, and knowing all those names tells you nothing about the bird, its behavior, its biology, how it relates to other birds. The name is not the thing. Most of what we call our own thoughts are names. They're labels, inherited framings, second-hand conclusions absorbed from the culture and mistaken for original thinking. That's just how people are. You have to be realistic. That's not how the world works. These aren't thoughts. They're installed conclusions wearing the clothes of thoughts. Genuinely original thinking is rare precisely because it requires noticing that a category you were given is wrong, or that a question nobody is asking is the important one, or that an assumption everyone makes is false. And you can't do that from inside the assumption. You have to get outside it somehow. The scientists who changed everything, Copernicus, Darwin, Einstein, Bohr, weren't necessarily smarter than their contemporaries. They were willing to notice that a framework everyone was using was producing the wrong answers, and to take that seriously rather than explaining it away. That requires something most education actively discourages: questioning whether the category itself is right, not just whether you've applied it correctly. Questioning whether a thought is yours isn't philosophical navel-gazing. It's not paralysis. It's the entry point to actually thinking, as opposed to performing the motions of thinking while executing pre-installed conclusions. So what can you actually do with all of this? You can't stop thoughts from arriving pre-formed. That's not a realistic goal, and pursuing it will make you miserable. The unconscious will keep processing. The interpreter will keep narrating. Thoughts will keep arriving as outputs, not drafts. But there is a gap between the thought arriving and you endorsing it, acting on it, treating it as your position. That gap is small, easy to miss, but it's real, and you can learn to notice it. You can ask, when a thought arrives, especially a confident, obvious feeling one, Where did this come from? What does it take for granted? What would have to be false for this thought to be wrong? Whose voice does this sound like? Is this a conclusion I've actually examined, or is it a name I learned and have been carrying ever since? You can change the inputs deliberately. What you read, who you talk to, what problems you sit with over time, what you force yourself to argue against, all of that changes what the unconscious processes, which changes what arrives. You can't control the outputs directly, but you can influence the inputs, and the inputs shape the outputs. You can hold your most obvious beliefs with slightly more suspicion than your uncertain ones. The uncertain ones you know to question. The obvious ones feel like they don't need questioning, which is exactly why they need it most. The goal isn't to have thoughts with no origin. Everything has an origin. The goal is to be a more conscious participant in which origins you expose yourself to, and to catch the gap between a thought arriving and a thought being yours, because there's a version of you that just processes inputs and generates outputs and calls the whole thing thinking. And there's a version of you that does that, because that's unavoidable, but also occasionally steps back, looks at the output before endorsing it, and asks, is this actually true, or does it just feel true because I've never examined it? That second version is rarer. It's harder. It's what Feynman was pointing at when he distinguished knowing from knowing the name. The thought you just had probably wasn't yours in any deep sense, but what you do with that thought right now, in the gap between receiving it and acting on it, that might be the closest thing to you there is. Subscribe if this changed something. The next one goes even deeper.